I'm Annie Ujifusa. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a current bookbinding student at North Bennett Street School, and I am honored to have been selected for the Boston Public Library's Conservation Internship, funded by the Associates of the Boston Public Library. I had the opportunity to do a lot of hands-on conservation, treating rare books and manuscripts. I treated a first edition copy of The Underground Railroad, written by a man named William Still, who's been called the father of the Underground Railroad. When this book came to the lab, it was in a very poor condition. The back cover board was detached, the front cover board was barely hanging on, the spine covering had a tear almost all the way down with large losses, and the text block had a lot of tears and losses throughout as well. So I performed a reback, which is removing the materials from the spine. I did board reattachment, and I addressed all of the paper mending that the text block needed, all the tears, the losses. So on this book, one of the many steps I had to do was color matching tissue for the hinge to go underneath the original spine piece. And it's pretty difficult. It took me several swatches to do, but once I got there, it just blended in seamlessly, and it's really important. Otherwise, your eye will just catch that repair right away. End bands are found at the head and tail of a text block. They are made out of cloth, leather sometimes they're sewn on with thread, sometimes they serve a structural purpose, sometimes they're purely decorative. In this case, they're mostly decorative. These were made out of cloth, but when I took them off of the spine, they were in a really bad condition. They were brittle and tearing, and it wasn't safe to put them back onto the text block. So I ended up making new ones, color matching them to match the original, but we really didn't want to get rid of the original end bands because they're part of the history of the book. So we made a little compartment underneath the book in the protective enclosure, and now they'll get to stay with the book forever. I learned how to use the Gunnar machine, which is a machine that cuts custom mats and boxes. And so I got to make a custom fit protective enclosure for this book. The last touch we did for the protective enclosure was printing off a picture of the spine to adhere to the outside of the box so that you can see it when you're looking for it on a shelf. It's just right there and you don't have to open up the box. It was daunting at first because this was the very first rare book I've ever treated. It was super challenging, but extremely rewarding, and seeing the final project was satisfying. My favorite project this summer was the American Musical Primer, published in 1808 to teach people psalms for singing in church. This book was originally bound with a method that involves stabbing slits into the text block and then pulling tapes through, adhering those to the outside of the cover boards under the covering material. But those tapes had broken, and the text block was almost completely separated from the covering. And then there were a lot of losses to the paper, lots of tears. A huge chunk on the title page was held on by a paper clip. This was a great practice in thinking about the degree to which conservators should alter an object versus keeping as much of the original material intact as possible. We ended up deciding not to rebind it. What I did was address all the paper mending that needed to be done. I mended the tears, filled the losses. Almost every single outer folio of every section was torn at the fold, and so I strengthened those. And then I just ended up leaving all of the pages loose in the covering, but keeping them separate and unbound. The advantage of that was keeping the original tapes intact, keeping evidence of the original binding intact. And then it also leaves the option open for the future if anybody decided at another time that rebinding it would be the best option. I think what I really loved about this is that I'm fascinated by structures of books, and relatively recently in history has the structures of books become important to researchers as much as like the content inside them or the decorative materials that cover them. And so if I can help a future researcher in researching this binding, I'm happy to do that as long as it's safe for the book. For mending the tears in this paper, I cut super thin strips of Japanese tissue, really thin Japanese tissue, and then I used a wheat starch paste as the adhesive. But I think what really made it seamless in this case was toning the tissue. The way we get it usually is it's just a stark white color, and we can use acrylics to tone it down and make it look aged and dirty and old. This 10-week conservation internship was funded by the Associates of the Boston Public Library through a very generous donor. I want to thank the Associates of the Boston Public Library and the donor who made this possible. I could never thank you enough. This has changed my life, and I know I want to do conservation for the rest of my life, and I've learned an astonishing amount.